Last week, I read two fantastic sapphic novels back to back, and while they're each uniquely interesting and beautiful books in their own right, they also have a lot in common. They're both by women in translation, they both have a kind of punk philosophy and ethos, they're both really, really short, and as I said, they're both sapphic novels, and I want to talk about each of them in turn, so let's start with Boulder. Boulder is a tiny little novel by Eva Baltasar, originally written in Catalan and translated into English by Julia Sanchez and published by And Other Stories, not the clothing company. Boulder is just 100 pages long, and it's written in a kind of diary style. Everything we learn in this novel is from the protagonist's perspective. It's all her thoughts, her experiences, her feelings, so it's very one-sided, and that is especially important considering the entire novel is about a relationship, but we only see the relationship through her eyes. And the only name we have for her is Boulder, a nickname given to her by her girlfriend who's a geologist. At the very beginning of this little novella, Boulder is working as a cook at a summer camp on an island, and this is kind of what she does. She cooks. She's not a chef. She says she's not very good at cooking, but she uses her meager cooking skills to get job after job in different places, and she just kind of wanders. She's a wandering soul. Almost immediately, she moves onto a ship of some sort. I think it's a merchant vessel, and she's working as the cook on that vessel, serving up slop to all the people working there. And while the ship is off the coast of Chile, she gets chatting to one of the members of the crew, a geologist called Samza. Now, Boulder has spent her entire life just moving from place to place, and also moving from woman to woman. She doesn't like relationships, she doesn't like getting tied down, she has sex, she has fun, and then she just carries on. But when she meets Samza, she is captivated. She is almost annoyed at herself by the fact that she is falling in love immediately. Something about Samza has just taken her heart, taken her focus, her attention, and that's all she can now think about is this Icelandic geologist who has nicknamed her Boulder. And so the two of them end up moving to Reykjavik when Samza takes a job there. Before she knows it, 5 years have passed. Boulder has been living with her partner for all these years in Reykjavik, and she's actually managed to make a success in her own right by starting a Spanish food truck. And her food truck is really popular and she's earning really good money from it. Given how expensive Reykjavik is, this is great, good for her. Boulder never expected this life. And there's a part of her that feels angry. She sounds resentful in her tone. Her love for Samza makes up half of her, and the other half is everything else. And so there's a kind of resentment that you can feel inside of her. The idea that she's betraying herself by falling in love, like she let herself down. And that gets worse around the halfway point when Samza says, look, I'm nearly 40 and I want to have a child. It is now or never. Boulder, unsurprisingly, never wanted kids. That is something that was never part of her agenda, her roadmap, and she never even had a roadmap. And that's something that I can hugely relate to. But she wants to stay with Samza. She loves her so much. And so she goes, all right, have a kid. Go get a sperm donor, get yourself pregnant, carry the child, and do the thing. I will be here. And that's kind of all she can promise. I will be here. I will help raise the child. But there's certainly a lack of parental language in there. She's keeping an emotional distance from the whole situation. Her partner will have a child. It doesn't feel like it's Boulder's child. They are not having a kid. Her partner is. And from here, once the kid comes into the picture, that sense of resentment, second-guessing, questioning her life, etc., everything that you can kind of predict, starts happening. In fact, while Samza is pregnant, Boulder refers to the baby, the fetus, whatever, as a parasite. Now, depending on your perspective, it is not surprising that you might call Boulder cruel or selfish. I understand that completely. However, as someone who has never ever wanted children, and as someone who has lived hedonistically traveling around from place to place, I hugely relate to Boulder. And I think that this book really asks us to consider perspective. You might empathize with Boulder, And you might feel weird or guilty about that, you might not. You might hate her. You might judge her, you might, as I said, call her selfish. And I don't think any of these perspectives are wrong. But this is a book that asks you to consider other perspectives. If someone tells me Boulder is an awful protagonist who presents selfish tendencies, I can't disagree. And I can't judge someone for thinking that. And then I'd ask them not to judge me for relating to her as someone who has lived quite hedonistically over the last few years and doesn't want kids. So I feel like this book could almost be a kind of discussion point, a way of talking about your thoughts, your feelings, your wants, your needs, your relationship style, your approach to life and work and parenting, etc. It could open up discussions between people who feel differently, with Boulder sitting at the center. I find that really, really exciting. But as I said at the beginning, what's worth remembering is that this is all from Boulder's perspective. We do not get a look into Samsa's mind. The only things we know about her are the things that she tells Boulder, and Boulder relates to us. So we know that Samsa wants a kid. We know that Samsa's a geologist. But these are just things that Boulder tells us. We are trapped in the mind of Boulder. So this is a book led by bias, and arguably anything written in the first person kind of is, but the diary style of this, the fact that this book has no dialogue, the fact that every sentence is, I think this, I feel this is happening to me, this is what I want, this is how I feel. Boulder comes across as a very self-interested, potentially selfish person who is constantly going from crisis to crisis. She's feeling unsettled all of the time. And you pity her while also judging her. You can't really avoid it. And I find it absolutely captivating. The fact that she is a character and a protagonist that's very difficult to like and love depending on who you are and your sensibilities makes this a pretty punk book. The idea of having a lesbian protagonist who is very hedonistic, which is a thing a lot of people hate, I found it so moving. An unconventional, potentially very unlikable, gay woman protagonist, written in a diary style where all we have is her perspective and her feelings, her thoughts, her wants, makes this a very punk narrative that I absolutely adored. And the other sapphic novel that I read immediately after Boulder is Love Me Tender by Constance Debré, and this was translated from French into English by Holly James. Now, as far as I can tell, this is at least a semi-autobiographical novel, because the protagonist is called Constance, and she looks like the author, and she lives a very similar life. So let's say it's inspired by her own life. Now, I was sat in a cafe a few days ago. I'd had like 3 coffees in a row. I was really bouncing off the walls, and I was tearing through this book, falling deeper and deeper in love with the protagonist. I feel sorry for her. She is tragic. She's a tragic heroine, a victim. Her life is rough and difficult, and yet I found myself just adoring her, becoming addicted to her, inspired by her, wanting to meet her and love her and be her. She's fantastic. Again, this is a lesbian book about hedonism to a point. Our protagonist is a 47-year-old woman who, after 20 years of marriage, realizes that she's gay. So 3 years ago, she left her husband, she moved into a little studio flat in Paris, and she spends her days getting tattoos, going swimming, reading and writing in cafes, and sleeping around with any woman who comes along. She's having fun. She shaves her head, she gets nice and toned and feels strong and young. She's quit her life as a lawyer, and she dreams of writing a book, so she spends all her time reading and writing. She has a few different women on the go, some come along, some leave, but all the while, her ex-husband is weaponizing their 8-year-old son against her. Her ex-husband is behaving in a blatantly homophobic way and telling the kid that his mother is bad, that she's wrong, that she's dangerous. And this means that custody battles and visitation rights are becoming very tricky for her. The kid lives with his dad, who has custody. And obviously lawyers and courts are getting involved, and things are really tricky for her, framing the system as inherently homophobic Even in the face of the famous statistics about women versus men, mothers versus fathers, and who gets custody. The father has custody, the system seems homophobic, and her hedonism is not helping anything. But she has a right to live a happy life after presumably 20 years of denial, self-hatred maybe, because now she's living. And the prologue asks a really, really enticing question, which is this. Can we break up with family members? And more specifically and controversially, can we break up with our children? We always talk about breaking up with romantic love interests, breaking up with our partners, our husbands and wives. And over the last few years, a lot of people talk about the idea of breaking up with friends, which I think is a wonderfully healthy thing. You don't just lose a friend, you break up with them. Sometimes we have to sever ties with good friends for various reasons, and people are calling those breakups, and I like that. And here, Constance Debré asks us, can we break up with family members? Because she is breaking up with her son. She has this 8-year-old kid who is being taught to dislike her, who is growing apart from her. Their paths are diverging. They do not have a future together. Things are not going well. You can see that. In the prologue, she makes that clear. And so she kind of asks us the question, can you just break up with your own kid? Like, why not? If you know that your future and their future are very different things and are going to different places, why can't we break up with our kids, with our parents, with other members of our family? And I find that a really compelling question, a question that you don't really see get asked a lot. So this protagonist is spending her days getting tattoos, as I said, going swimming, having fun with her life. She's quit her really, really impressive career. She dreams of being a writer. And all the while she realizes that she's losing the battle against parenthood. And she's asking herself, how much am I actually supposed to care? I find that a really daring question, especially in the narratives of mothers. Mothers care about their kids. Mothers put their kids before anything else, anyone else. Mothers would die for their children, etc., etc. What about a woman who wouldn't? What about a woman who is happy to separate herself from her kid when she logically understands that the future is not there for them? I absolutely love that. There's a rationality to it, even if it seems cold and almost cruel. There is a rationality to it, and perhaps in the long run it would serve them both better. I really, really find that so fascinating. But, as I said, there is a tragedy to this story. She is a tragic protagonist in a lot of ways, and you feel desperately sorry for her. But at the same time, I kept thinking, yeah, I want to live her life. I want to be her. She is inspiring. In your mid-40s, realizing you're gay and going off and living that life in a sexual way, in a romantic way, living your best life. I'm not going to call her selfish. I'm going to praise her. So here we have two protagonists who are arguably unlikable, who are both sapphic, both living their best lives as much as they can, or not, and trying to get back on track, or making the best with what they have. There is a groundedness to these women, and there is an obvious punk attitude to two unlikable gay women going against the grain, going against conservatism and traditionalism in every way possible. Two incredible books by women in translation, translated by women, full of sapphic sex and hedonistic living. Absolutely brilliant stuff. I am enamored. Please check both of these books out. They absolutely deserve your attention. They are raw and punk and queer, and I love them. Now it's time for my Patreon book recommendation of the week, and this recommendation comes from Laura Vrend, who has recommended Build Your House Around My Body by Violet Cooper-Smith. Laura has quoted the Goodreads description, which says this: "Two young women go missing decades apart. Both are fearless, both are lost, and both will have their revenge. In 1986, the teenage daughter of a wealthy Vietnamese family loses her way in an abandoned rubber plantation while fleeing her angry father and is forever changed. In 2011, a young, unhappy Vietnamese-American woman disappears from her new home in Saigon without a trace." And as for what Laura had to say, this book is strange and beautiful, intricately woven, frightening and magical, with luscious and winding sentences and characters that I related to on an existential level, even when they're truly extraordinary and otherworldly. It's a mind-blowing ride. The only book I've ever read that had me close the book after coming to the end of a chapter, put it down, and literally say aloud, "Holy shit, now that was a chapter." It warrants multiple rereads, and I can't wait to see what Violet Cooper-Smith does next. Now that is a recommendation. Thank you, Laura. Alright, if you need more punk literature, women in translation, and sapphic books in your life, which we all do, check out these two fantastic books, Love Me Tender and Boulder, and subscribe for books.